Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 25th anniversary LITQUAKE. We are San Francisco's literary festival. My name is Nora Peel, and I'm the executive director of LITQUAKE. This year, we're bringing 2.5 weeks of programming from last night until the 26th, over 140 events with more than 500 authors. Tonight, we are honored to present an evening with Booker Prize winner Paul Lynch. This event is part of our Words Around the World series. I'd like to offer special thanks to the Government of Ireland Immigrant Support Program, Culture Ireland, and the Center for the Art of Translation for helping make this series and this particular event possible. A few quick orders of business before we get started. We're a small nonprofit, and we're proud of the fact that nearly 90% of our events each year, including this one, are free. I want to thank those of you who already added on a donation when you reserved your seat tonight. And if you turn to page 31 in your program, you can see that individual donations, most coming from small donors, form a huge piece of our festival funding. So please consider dropping us a few dollars if you haven't already. We accept donations on Venmo, at LitQuakeSF, on PayPal, at info@litquake.org, or directly at litquake.org. And you're in luck tonight because I brought along some of our brand new 2024 swag. So if you make a donation of any size, or if you did on your way in tonight, we'll thank you with a LITQUAKE reading light or a glitter sticker. And if you make a donation of $25 or more on site tonight, you can get one of our brand new mugs, or $50 or more, you can get a brand new tote bag, just like public radio. On your seat tonight, you hopefully found a survey somewhere nearby. Please do take a couple minutes to fill that out at some point this evening. They're completely anonymous, and we need this info to apply for the foundation and government funding that we do receive. There should be pencils in the backs of your pews, but if not, please let a volunteer or myself know, and we can hook you up with a pencil after the show. Tonight's authors' books are for sale, thanks to Mrs. Dalloway's, and both Paul and Ethel will be signing out in the atrium after the event. For those of you joining us from home, hello, Mrs. Dalloway's will have extra signed copies of Prophet Song available at their store while supplies last. I just want to thank this year's major sponsors of LITQUAKE. Those include California Humanities, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, the Hawthornden Foundation, the Margaret and William R. Hearst Foundation, the Minor Anderson Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, and San Francisco Grants for the Arts. I also want to thank our media sponsors, San Francisco Chronicle, KALW, KQED, KEXP, Bay Area Reporter, SF Arts, Johnny Fun Cheap, 7x7, and Publishers Weekly. And last but not least, thank you so much to Unitarian Universalist Church of Berkeley for hosting us. Part of my objectives for this year was to bring more events from LITQUAKE to the East Bay. I'm also a member here at UCB, so it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this beautiful space. Hopefully you saw the amazing view outside before the sun started going down. And now I'd like to introduce our interviewer for the evening. Irish author Ethel Rohan is an award-winning essayist, novelist, and short story writer. Most recently, her short story collection, In the Event of Contact, won the Dzanc Prize, the Eric Hoffer Prize, and a Gold Independent Publisher Book Award for Best European Fiction. She has published widely beyond her books, including work in the New York Times, World Literature Today, the Washington Post, the Irish Times, Writer's Digest, Crime Reads, LitHub, and The Stinging Fly. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of being in conversation with Ethel about her recently released second novel, Sing I, so I can vouch for how great it is. Please join me in welcoming Ethel Rohan and Paul Lynch.
Hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening, including those of you joining us by live stream. It's my great pleasure and honor to be in conversation tonight with Paul Lynch. For those of you who might have already noticed that my top is indeed coordinated with the book cover, well done. Not sure if Paul noticed that.
I'm impressed.
Paul
I'm
is
very
jet lagged,
impressed.
something I can relate to, having just recently returned from London. Booker Prize winner Prophet Song is Lynch's fifth novel, hailed by the Booker Prize jury as soul-shattering and truly a masterful work. The novel also won the 2024 Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Lynch was recently appointed Distinguished Writing Fellow at Maynooth University and elected to Aistana, which honours artists who have made outstanding contributions to the creative arts in Ireland. He lives in Dublin, my home city, where Prophet Song is set. The novel is the story of a society and liberal democracy in the grip of a new tyrannical regime. And at its centre is Eilish Stack, a mother of four desperately trying to hold her family together as their homeland evolves into hellish chaos and what were once unthinkable, nightmarish living conditions become the new norm. Paul, before we go into Prophet Song, this wonderful novel was my first introduction to you. So I'd love to know a little more about you, your background, and your journey from then to now.
Oh gosh, how do you do that? By the way, I should just warn you all that there may be some glitches in the matrix tonight, because I've been on, in the last 6 days, I've flown from Dublin to Chicago to Houston to Dallas to Seattle to Portland to here. So I'm a little bit, here. But anyhow, it's going to be fine. If I drop a question.
Start to shake.
So who am I? The interesting thing is the journey, when you look back on your life thus far, all these little roads you were taking suddenly start to look like a direction. When I was 11 years old, my mother marched me down the town to the second-hand bookshop and got me a job, which, when we think back on that now, it's kind of like child slavery, really. And I was getting paid about £2 a day. But I suddenly had a shop full of books because I'd read everything in the library and at home, and my mum had had enough of this. She thought, let's get him into a world of books, and it was great. And sometimes when I'd be the owner, Mickey Heron, he'd say to me, Paul, can you come here and do this? And I'd be reading a book, and I'd say, can you just give me 5 minutes? I'm going getting to the end of this chapter. And, I actually got kicked out of honours English in school, which is very strange to say, but I had trouble with the teacher, and I didn't like him. And so I was giving him a lot of stick. And so he banished me to pass English. And I learned sometime later from my mother, many years later, because I was reinstated. And she said to me, oh, do you know what happened to you that time? And it turned out that some teachers from the school had got together with my parents and went to the headmaster and said, this guy cannot be in pass English. He has to be in honours English. And it's an extraordinary intervention. It was an amazing thing because that intervention actually changed my life. Mm. So teachers are incredibly important. The right teachers are incredibly important. Yeah. Because when I did the Leaving Cert cycle, honours, the writers that I read then changed my life. T.S. Eliot, Thomas Hardy, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and so on and so forth. Those writers went into my DNA. They changed me. And so from that point on, I just wanted to work with language. I wanted to work with words. And so I dropped out of my university degree. I was studying philosophy and English. I started at 19 working for the Sunday Tribune in Dublin, a national newspaper, as a sub-editor. And I was just drifting sort of unconsciously. There was no ambition. But I look back now, it's like that kid, he just wanted to work with words. And so I went into the Sunday Tribune and I got 1 day a week, one shift on a Friday night on the news desk. And I started, you're editing copy, writing headlines. And I loved it. And it just took off from there. And, suddenly, within no time at all, I was a full-time job. Just thousands of hours spent editing people and just absorbing how language worked. And it was an amazing experience. And through that period, I later became a film critic.
Yeah.
Became the chief film critic of that paper, and did that for 5 years or so, and reviewed over 1,000 films. And then one day when I was 30, I had never written any fiction. I'd written some poetry on and off in my teens, and I'd stopped. And we all write poetry in our teens. So even when you're a teenager, you don't even take it seriously. You know, it's like, I'm just writing poetry. I can't take this seriously.
Poetry or songs, right?
Yeah, well, I also wrote, I was in bands as well, you know, and as you can tell. I got to 30, and there was this sort of tumult, this upheaval going on in my body, in my mind. I didn't know what it was. And it was because I wasn't writing. I wasn't doing the thing that I was supposed to be doing. And I was in a taxi going up this hill on the island of Lipari in Sicily on a holiday. And suddenly, just this epiphany, this thunderbolt, this voice said, like, you are meant to be writing fiction. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And everything you're doing till now is a lie. It's not what, like, and I remember just kind of thinking, fuck, I have to swerve, I have to change. And it was like, it's an extraordinary moment, because how did I know I was supposed to be writing fiction if I had not been writing fiction? This is the thing, the intuitive voice is extraordinary. But it was right. It was right. And so that day I went to the hotel, and I took out my laptop, and I just started writing a short story that had been in my head for a long time, that I'd been denying myself the right to write it.
Right.
And so what had happened was I gave myself permission, and the big no voice, you know, we all have the big no voice. No, you can't do that. The big no voice disappeared, and suddenly, whoo, and that was the start of it.
I was curious about that. You mentioned your first foray into fiction writing was the short story. Do you continue in that form, or are you solely a novelist?
No, I'm a novelist. And the way I think about it is this. I write very little nonfiction. Maybe an essay once a year, if I'm even lucky. I never write short stories. I've only published 2 short stories ever. For me, the idea of, like I say, I'm a novelist. That's, to me, it's just that there's a statement in it, there's meaning in that, because the novel for me is a container. And when I'm writing a novel, everything goes into it. The poetry goes into it. A lot of people say, oh, you should be a poet. It's like, no, it goes into the novel. The novel is all consuming. You know, it's like a symphony. It's just like sucking everything out of you. And it's just, the poetry goes into it. The ideas for nonfiction, it goes into it.
Yeah.
The short story ideas, it goes into it. But the novel then demands a certain degree of form and shaping and law that knocks all those edges off those separate things and turns it into a single, clean story. And I really like that. I just like the way the novel absorbs all of those things.
Yeah, I can see why you would need the novel, having read Prophet's Song. It's just got such big ideas.
Yeah.
You kind of need that bigger vessel.
Yes.
Before we dive into Prophet's Song, this is your 5th novel. How does it compare to the previous 4? Is that too large a question?
How does it compare?
Would you say thematically there's like
well, you know, I feel like I'm writing the same book every time.
Yeah.
I'm like Hitchcock. You know, underneath you just see him making the same thing over and over. And he changes the setting and the scenery and the actors, but he's just kind of doing the same thing over and over again. And that's how I feel about my own books. And my editor goes, she says, every book you write's so different. I'm like, no, they're not. They're actually the same. But it's you know what? Every book that I've written can be identified in some way as an ordeal narrative. I like the idea of taking characters and subjecting them to something that's where they're pushed beyond their limits. Like my characters are always in this moment of the known, and then suddenly they're in the unknown. They're placeless, and they're forced to begin a journey where, in many ways, it's psychoanalytical. Like there's like they have to figure out who they truly are on this journey, but they also have to survive. They also have to dig very deep. Like Dostoevsky once said, how much human being is in a human being? This is something that really interests me. And so all of my novels are very metaphysical. They're going after questions about what is it to be a human being? What are we made of? What's the stuffing inside us? How do we arrive at a sense of dignity in this world? All my books have this, arraignment of a silent world, an inalienable, silent universe that we're in, with characters who feel like we all do, that they want to have meaning and they want to have some dignity, and the world just doesn't give a damn. And that's two energies if you think about it, if I say this, here we are in a church, but I'm somebody who has no faith, and so as many of us do in this time, and if that's the case, how do you arrive at meaning? It's a really important question. And how do you make sense of the world that you're in when the world really is going to throw its worst at you? Because the unwanted always knocks on your door. And so this is the sort of the blueprinting of all my novels, that these questions are always being asked, these sort of impositions on character are always occurring, but the scenery changes.
Yeah.
And so the first 3 books were, to use a horrible term, historical. I hate the term because it's kind of meaningless and it suggests a kind of genre. But they were set in the past, and they were they were sort of mining for human truth, but in that kind of way that I like to do. But at the same time, they're getting into the Irish psyche, into sort of the mythos of Ireland in certain kinds of ways. And then my 4th book, Beyond the Sea, was this very existential short novel about 2 guys adrift on an ocean in the Pacific Ocean. And the book was like this sort of existential laboratory where 2 guys are on a boat, they cannot be saved, but they're alive. So they're alive and dead at the same time, and so I'm going to work on them, asking questions about what is it to be alive,
Yeah.
How do we arrive at meaning, all these things I'm talking about. And that book allowed me to figure out a way into the present moment, so I was able to take those ideas that I'd used in more mythic settings and take that mythic thing that I've been working on and move it into the present moment. So the mythic is there, present, but in an entirely contemporary setting.
Is Prophet Song your first urban setting?
I do believe it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously place so affects story. Were you conscious of that? Like, did you need it to be an urban setting for this particular novel?
Well, I mean, like, need and want aren't something that come into it. When you write, there's fiction is not a choice. If it is a choice, it's probably not going to be any good. Fiction chooses you. And so, as writers, what we find ourselves doing is rationalizing after the fact. We figure out what it was we were doing. But, very often, at least for me, the work arrives intuitively. Art begins as a feeling, and you must unpack that feeling. And like the opening of this book arrived to me entirely intuitively. I had been working on the wrong book for quite a long time, and I decided that I was done with that. And when I, on a Monday morning, just decided to do something different, having no idea what I was going to do, I wrote the opening of the book without any sort of preconception of what it would be. And it's so important because, as artists, what we're really doing is sort of channeling our own subconscious, channeling the demonic inside you. That door, I call it the door into the dark. You don't know what's going to come through. You can't think your way into it. And very often when you're in between books, I walk around thinking up novels. They're never the books that I write. The books that I write arrive without any knowledge. And the best ones that have that quality because, writing is not rational. And of course there is rationality involved. There's a line that I love from Ingmar Bergman. He says that intuition is the spear you throw into the dark, and intellect is the army you send in afterwards. So you have to have an army to shape it and to give it direction and to sort of figure out what are the ideas that I'm mining here, that I'm going after. But before you've done that, the thing has arrived, and it's suggestive to you of something that you don't quite fully understand. And so you often get images and you have to unpack the images. And you know, the really interesting thing for me about this idea of not truly knowing what you're doing and yet knowing what you're doing is that when I was finished the book and I look back on it, you know, that opening page that came to me from the blind intuitively when I started, was looking back on when I had the finished book. The meaning of the book is encoded symbolically in the opening sentences. It's all there.
Yeah.
And this has happened to me before. It happened to me with my third book, Grace. I started writing that book without having any idea what I was doing. And then when I understood what I was doing, I realized I'd already been researching the book for quite a long time, without having any conscious knowledge of that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'm a meditator, and I've been meditating for a long time. And so it's great fun if you're a meditator because you get to watch the creative process with a kind of detached view. You know, you're able to sort of get a sense of, from a you get a degree of metacognition where you're looking down at yourself, and you get to see the creative process, and it's fascinating. Like you realize that, you know, so much of who we go around during the day thinking you are this person. And, you know, the ego's at the steering wheel, driving the car, honking the horn and trying to figure out what it wants to do and what it wants next and what it desires and, you know, future orienting itself. And it's just this sliver of actually what you are.
Yeah.
And so when you're an artist, you're really trying to shut that down and get into everything else, what you are. And so you find yourself sitting here rationalizing things that actually are not rational.
Yeah. You mentioned that story for you starts with a feeling, and I would imagine the core feeling starting this would have to be terror, which brings me to Eilish Stack, our central character. How did you inhabit her so completely, particularly her motherhood, her fear, that sense of terror and her grief?
Well, you know, when I wrote that opening page, she was there.
Yeah.
She was completely there. She was in the language. She was already this distinct, present human being. But what I do with characters is, you know, I listen to them. I just listen. And what I realized, at least the character that I wanted to write or was figuring out who wanted to be written, it's her complexity is what makes her compelling. It's her complexity within a blind world that makes her compelling. The complexity is, on one side, it's what many of us are, which is parents, you know, career people, spouses, children, in this extremely structured world that we all live in, where she's dealing with 3 teenagers. She has a surprised infant.
Yeah.
She's married to Larry, who's a deputy general secretary in the Teachers Union of Ireland, which is a very powerful union. She's an executive in a pharmaceutical company, and her father Simon is a retired scientist and sliding into dementia. It's a lot to be holding in one space, and she's holding all of this, but in the background, the politics of the country is changing, and the government has been elected, and there's been a populist government. And before the book opens, there's been an Emergency Powers Act that has allowed the government to take control of the judiciary, and there are curbs on the media, and the general rule of law is beginning to slide. But it's just been in that, it's happening in that way, that sort of creeping way, that she's not truly paying attention to it.
Yeah. Because
you're caught up in your life. And this is the focus of the book. It's the focus on the book is in the kitchen. It's where there's not enough milk in the fridge.
Yeah.
That's that. And so these are this is the complexity that I zoom in on. And then that's what makes her really interesting for me, because as the unraveling starts to occur, and it is an unraveling, it's a complete, God Almighty, it's a complete destruction of a modern liberal democracy. But as it happens piece by piece, she is just exactly what we all are. holding her life together, trusting, perhaps foolishly, that this won't be allowed to happen.
Yeah.
You know, that common sense is going to prevail.
Yeah.
And so, to me, she's kind of Greek. I think of her as like a Greek character. She's moving through this book, trying to make decisions to save her family, trying to read the signs. But you can't read the signs. You can't read what's going on. The mechanism that's unfolding is beyond reading. It's too chaotic.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like the fates, you know, the blind fates shaping the destiny.
Yeah.
And she moves through the world making decisions, but reaping always the unforeseen. And that's how life is for all of us. I'm fascinated by that idea of that, you know, both Virginia Woolf and Faulkner, both of them talked about that all we have is just matchlight in the dark.
Yeah.
We just have this small flame. All of us, that's what life is. We're just surrounded by darkness. How do we make the right decisions? This is the metaphysics of what my books are. All of them are about. How can you know what the right thing to do is? And so she moves through the dark with this small flame. And that's why I think she was the most complex character I've written.
Yeah, that's such a powerful image, the matchstick.
Yeah.
I found what you spoke about there, like her inability to even comprehend that this could happen. You know, it really is the unthinkable become real. I don't know, she's a scientist, and her dad is a scientist, and I wonder, could you talk a little bit about them as parallel characters? Her dad, Simon, also, he's sort of parallel to what's happening in the country, in that, you know, what was known to him has also become unknown. My mother had Alzheimer's, so perhaps I latched onto him, but I also found him I suppose, surprisingly complex character in that he is losing himself.
Yeah, you know, Simon has, you know, Simon is her father who's disappearing before her eyes, at the same time as the world that she knows is disappearing before her eyes, the world of liberal democracy. And Simon sees this. You know, there's moments he confuses Eilish's daughter for Eilish.
Yeah.
You know, he's like, what's Eilish? You know, like he's mixing up the generations. But then he has these moments of startling clarity. And at one point, you know, he says to her, you know, he's discussing the nature of reality with her. He says, you took the degree. You're a scientist. You understand what the real is. This is what science is. He's talking about objective reason. And he says, well, you know, tradition is the only thing tradition is only what we can all agree on. And we now have a government that is muddying reality. And the way they do it is they take control of the institutions. And when you take control of the institutions, then you take control of the facts. Because you can say one thing is another thing. And you can say it enough times, people start to believe it. And then you're in a different reality. He says that's what they're doing. And so I find that really interesting. Because, you know, I was reading The Guardian and the New York Times today about people actually like harassing meteorologists for suggesting that they had, you know, made up claims about the storm in Florida, the hurricane that they had, or that the government is in control of the weather, and like, it's kind of so astonishing that when you see this happening. But we're in this now too. Mm-hmm. And something has happened where, you know, we've come off the grid, or at least there's a whole cohort of people who have just come off the grid of reality. And the consensus reality that we all used to share, where we could at least agree on what was real objectively, so that we could figure out policies. If we didn't like each other's policies, at least we had a sense of what reality was. And then we could figure out how to come about it. But now we don't even know what reality is.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of shattering of our epistemology of how we decide what real is. How do we justify what real is? And it's an extraordinary, like this is part of where the book's coming from.
Yeah.
Is seeing into the sort of chaos of the moment that we're in. Because, you know, the modern project of the Enlightenment is that, as I see it, is that we have created objective reason through science and that allows us to justify our beliefs. This is how we understand the world. And of course, human beings are deeply irrational, so we need some degree of objectivity to justify how we understand the world, to ground the decisions we make. But there are many things that are contributing to this, but the social media in particular is unraveling our sense of objective reason.
Yeah.
And we're in this heightened, rocket-fueled relativism where, you know, there's a complete breach in trust in objectivity, in expertise, in science, and now people are just going off what they feel is true.
Yeah.
And that's a really dangerous place to be. You know, like if I feel something is true, and I act according to that, and that's the mechanism that everyone is, or a lot, then you're in a profound chaos.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of things that I was thinking about writing the book, but I just didn't see it getting to the point where people would think that other people were controlling the weather.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
right? Where do you go with that? I mean, if you were to even, as a novelist, I'm going to write a book where people think that people are controlling the weather, you'd go, that's ridiculous. But here we are.
As you say, the novel captures all of that so powerfully and chillingly. And I was struck by that, you know, this idea of the big lie. And if you tell people the same thing, you know, often enough, the big lie, they will believe it. And I was struck by the irony of Eilish, who increasingly throughout the novel needs to tell small lies in order to survive. I'm not going to give away any plot, but at one point where the end of the novel, Eilish is required to tell a larger lie out of love, again, in keeping with survival, but it has devastating consequences. And I wondered how that played out for you as author. I know you say that, you know, it's not a question of choices, but were you surprised by how, you know, the irony of her needing to tell the lie and the horrific consequences and injustice of that in tandem with a country and a regime that are lying with seemingly no consequence?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really important moment early in the book where Eilish makes a decision to lie to her 12-year-old son about where their father is, because the state has just gobbled him up. He's just been disappeared. And she the two older kids know, but she decides not to tell Bailey. And the lie then sort of hangs out of her mouth like this. I think the words in the book is this dead-tonguing, poisonous flower. She realizes that you can't lie to a child. If you lie to a child, you're corrupting something truly enormous. Because when the child finds out you've told a lie, God, there's no going back. And so there's this breach between the two of them. And when he does find out what happens, you know, he sort of crumples he crumples to the floor. She sees in him, in his response, you know, the known world become the unknown world, where, you know, like how do you explain to a child that this world of law and order and civil values and all that no longer exists? It's a very hard thing to do. And so all the way through the book, she's shaped by her denial, by her resistance to the truth of what's unfolding, her resistance to the reality. And the reality, you know, at one point Simon, her father, again says, you know, you can deny reality for a certain period of time, but reality will always level the scales.
Yeah.
Reality is always waiting.
It'll catch up with
It
you.
will it's a metaphysical law. Whether it's for a regime or for your own denial, reality will always assert itself. It always does. And so for her, that's what happens. She moves through the book in denial. And, you know, at one point, you know, when we've moved through very serious unraveling of this world, Eilish is meeting with she's meeting with a wife of another man who's been disappeared.
Yeah.
And the wife says to her, even the dogs in the street know what's happened to our husbands. And Eilish cannot. She stands up and she leaves. Because her attitude is this, there cannot be despair where there's doubt. And where there's doubt, there's hope. And so she moves through this space, hoping that the world will be righted. And in many ways, that's part of the questions that are being asked in this book about how we all assume that what we have known the world to be shall continue. It's a really dangerous fallacy. Just because you've grown up in a liberal democracy doesn't mean it's going to continue. History shows that really, we've all had this blessed moment in time. Why should it continue?
Yeah.
I'm not making claims about whether it will or it won't, but the book is asking questions about that, about what the fallacy of assuming that common sense is going to prevail. I mean, Jesus, I even do it myself. I watch the news, and it's happened countless times, whether, it's a piece of legislation in a country that has always been right and honorable, or it's a country that, about to elect a leader that you're thinking, they cannot do this. They're not going to do this.
Yeah.
They're not going to bring through that piece of legislation. They're not going to vote for that.
Yeah.
Because, geez, if you vote for that, you're really shooting yourself in both feet and the knees and the arm. And then they do it.
Yeah.
And so, this is fascinating. Yeah, it's just fascinating to me that about how we really underestimate our own stupidity.
Yeah. Well, I think, as you say, we're just so rigid in our belief system and what we, think is and isn't possible. It brings me back to the early days, weeks, even months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there was so much of that where it seemed, oh no, that couldn't happen, that's impossible. They're not going to close the schools, we're not going to be on lockdown. It just seemed impossible. And even those scenes, it was March 17th in San Francisco, and you get the news, we're going on lockdown. And of course I hop in my car and race to the grocery store, and it is pandemonium. And so that called back to me reading Prophet Song, but we spoke earlier, and this predates the pandemic.
It does. I started writing the book in 2018, and at one point I was writing this book and suddenly found myself living in the conditions in which I'd been writing. Maybe I did.
The ultimate creator.
And I'm suddenly living in a police state, so to speak. I use the term, I'm in favor of what happened, of course,
yes,
because
same.
It saved my father's life without a doubt. And I had long COVID too, and a lot of people seem to confuse public health measures for, like a public health emergency for an attempt to control the, to seize for an insurrection or whatever it is. I'm using the wrong. There's the jet lag, right? What's the word when the government or when they try and power grab?
Are you talking
a
like
coup,
a
thank you.
coup? Oh.
Public health measure, coup, not the same thing, as we found out. But anyhow, you can't argue reasonably or rationally with such beliefs, which are beliefs. But anyhow, but I found myself looking out the window going, Jesus, I've been writing about this and now I'm living in it. And I thought about Scott Ian, who was the guitar player in a metal band called Anthrax. And when the Anthrax scare happened, gosh, when was that? He said, I'm not going to die an ironic death. And that's how it was. I just thought, but I was also met with the bizarre sense that I'd already written about the pandemic to a certain degree, or at least symbolically, because my previous book, Beyond the Sea, was about two guys who go out, they get washed out into the Pacific Ocean, and they find themselves suddenly met with this instant and profound social isolation. And they're totally cut off from the world. And the book is also fundamentally about that. And it's about how one or the other of them starts to have a problem with the nature of reality. And one of them starts to confuse his beliefs with the real. Yeah. And the other one doesn't. And so they're at odds in an extraordinary way. And so I was thinking to myself, Jesus, I've already written a COVID novel before. Yeah, I should think very carefully about what I write next. Right?
Really? You seem
I'm going
to
to write a really happy story.
You seem
We
to
need a
have
happy future. We need a happy decade.
uncanny foreknowledge.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of happy stories, you are very, very clear that Prophet Song is not a dystopian novel. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, you see these labels, dystopian, like people start reading this book and they think, oh, it's dystopian. It seems to be set in the future, although it could also be a counterfactual present. The book just doesn't say. I'm not even sure that I've decided whether it's counterfactual or set in the future. The book has its own laws. It's doing its own thing.
Yeah.
But you start reading the book and you may think, this is dystopian, this is what dystopian fiction is. And then you'll realize, if you're paying attention, that the book is completely exploding the form. It explodes the form in the way that you realize what's actually happening in this book through this simulation is actually the real elsewhere around the world. It's what you have been watching on the TV every night all your life. It's what you have been denying, and you deny it through what we call the other. You see other people going through this, and they don't look quite like you, and they come from different cultures, they live in different parts of the world, they've got different problems, and you say, oh, that's their problem. I feel sympathy for them, but that's their problem. That's how their world is. That's how it always is. I can't do anything about it, I just move on. But that's an other, and we're us. But the book completely, like a Trojan horse, sneaks you into the other until the distinction collapses. There is no us and them, and there is no us and other. It's all one world. And so the book is a simulation that, lots of people in Europe, for example, think this book's about what's going to happen to us. This is a cautionary tale. And it's like, no, you could read it that way, but it's just as much, or if not more, about what has actually always been happening. Yeah. And we talked about backstage about a passage towards the end of the book where Eilish is looking out at the world, and she has come through the 9 circles of hell, and she's in the 9th circle of hell at this point, and she is looking out, and she realizes that this idea of I'm in a church now, I should be careful, but she realizes that this idea of biblical apocalypse that you grow up with, that it's a myth. It's just a story. And that actually the end of the world is always recurring again and again and again and again and again, but it's always a local event. It comes to your town, your city, knocks on your door. Yeah. It's the end of the world for your family, your community, your people, but to everybody else, we just watch it on the news. It's an event that passes into the history books. It passes into myth. And this is, what this book is really fundamentally about. It's the mythic space that this book occupies. That's why I always say it's not a political novel. So much of political fiction is written with the answer already known. It already knows what it wants to change. It knows the answers to the problems it sets out. That's grievance. Grief is something completely different. Not grievance, but grief. Grief is what you cannot change. Grief is the human condition. It's what we cannot change within ourselves. It's what we cannot know. It's what lies beyond our ken. Grief is the problem of loss. Grief is the irrecoverability of everything that's lost. What's lost is lost.
Yeah.
And so this book is a wail of grief for what we are always, what we're doing now, and it's happening in the world right now. Like since this book was written, 2 major wars have broken out. Yeah. And so the book is about that, but it's about what has always been. It's about what will always come to be. And so the book opens with a quote from Ecclesiastes: "There's no new thing under the sun." There is, unfortunately, as I see it, as a novelist, a kind of wretchedness built into the human condition. Mm-hmm. We like to aspire loftily towards high goals of civilization, and there are times when we can achieve it for periods of time, but Jesus, we like to undo it very quickly, and we can undo it. And And we deny that because, well, one of the reasons we deny it is because we are a very deeply irrational species, creature. The irrational is built into us. And so we deny the very thing that we are, always. And we would do really well if we'd recognize our irrationality.
Yeah.
And so this book's a whale of grief.
Yeah. And do well to recognize our past mistakes. Like, we just don't seem to evolve. We don't seem to learn. I definitely thought a lot of eternal return as I was reading this, and my grandmother would always say, this life, humanity, this is purgatory. Like, we're doomed to sort of recreate the worst of us over and over and over again.
Yeah, and like, lived experience is so important in providing a foundation for memory. And, after World War II, there was this profound psychic impact on what, on the Western concept of what it is we need to preserve, what we need to rebuild and preserve, which is civilization. Civilization is an ideal, and you build it with really great leaders who understand what it is and are able to communicate that to the masses. And we're now at a time where we've had a lack of that caliber of leadership. And the problem is tribalism is an instinct. Tribalism is wired into us. And you create the right conditions and we will revert back to tribalism. And so the historical is always, it's built into us. The thing that has been is inside us, and you just have to create, unfortunately, certain conditions, it will reemerge.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you were a film critic. I think you've said you've reviewed over 1,000 films, but you've also said that you do not want prophet songs to be adapted to film, at least not Hollywood film. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, it probably will be made into a film, to be honest with you. But would I have it turned into a Hollywood film? Not on your life.
Yeah.
Because then it's just going to be filleted into a thriller of some kind. And the complexity that this book offers is going to be, dismissed. And I have to say, as a film, I love cinema very much, and I take it's really important to me, and it's been a huge influence on my fiction. But fiction for me offers something that actually, this is a personal bias, but I think that fiction offers something that almost no other art form can compete with. And you can damn me later for that statement, but that's my personal opinion. And I think that fiction can just do things that are really quite extraordinary. It gives you both a sense of the objective and the subjective all at once. It gives you a sense of time. Time is so hard to deal with. Cinema gives you time, but it cannot give you the subjective, really. And so, fiction can give you the subjective, the objective, the sense of time. It can enter fully into the strangeness within time, within the subjective, within the objective. The strangeness that is life. Life is fundamentally strange. When you really if you sit with it, it's strange. When you climb outside your little narrow ego and you look at it and you sit and face the darkness, it's fundamentally unknowable. And so fiction can bring to bear this, an infinite amount of different lenses upon the complexity. And that's why I love this. I just love the form. I love the art form. I mean, I love painting. I love poetry. There's a huge amount of stuff that I love. But storytelling and the novel do something at their best that I personally believe is unmatched. And of course, I'm biased because I'm a novelist. But to me, when I think about storytelling, it's doing something that's of vital importance. And I think of it like this. In the abstract, mathematicians and physicists write equations in the abstract that we know are true. We don't quite see them in reality, but we know that they're demonstrably true. Fiction writers also work in the abstract, and they create equations of human truth. The really great stories, the great novels, Tolstoy, Woolf, Austen, whoever it is that you love them because they are equations of human truth that are absolutely indisputably true. And that's why they endure. That's what the canon actually is. There's been so much confusion about what the canon is or what it should be. The canon is truth. Whatever speaks to you truthfully of the human condition, that's what endures. There's a reason why it endures. There's a reason why artists, why writers constantly reread the writers from the past. And so that's what fiction, ultimately, the really good stuff, is actually doing and should be doing. It's looking at what truth is. It's trying to find some hidden gleam of knowledge that we did not know was there. And the writer has sensed something. They've opened this door for us. And suddenly we're seeing into that world that we could not see before. And so it's a very noble, crazy, ridiculous thing to do. But when it happens, it's beautiful.
Yeah, as you're saying all that, I mean, there were so many times reading this book that I found extraordinary where I was saying, yes, that is how it is. Like, but Eilish's and every character in the story, like, their experiences are so extreme. And I was sort of like, how can I have this radical empathy? Like, how can I even imagine that I know how that feels? But it is so powerfully done and so cinematic. And yeah, it was just that sense of, yes, that is how it is. That is truth.
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing this book, I knew that I was going to ask something very serious of the reader. And there are moments in this book, for those of you who've read it, chapter 8, you know what chapter 8 is. People look at me with a 1,000-yard stare. They know what chapter 8 is. And I've had people say to me that they're on long-haul flights and they got to chapter 8 and they're sitting there sobbing in their seats, and someone's going, "What's wrong with you?" and they can't explain it.
Yeah.
Chapter 8 is chapter 8.
Yeah.
And the thing about that is I take that really seriously, the responsibility of that. In many ways, the book is conceived as Medusa's mirror. You create a mirror that allows you to stare at the Medusa without turning to stone yourself. That's really important, that you're able to look at the truth of the monster, the Gorgon, or whatever it is you want to look at, without having to turn to stone. If you're going to look into the abyss, you don't fall into the abyss. Yeah. And so I take that responsibility very seriously, to such an extent that I actually couldn't even write chapter 8 for many months. I had a degree of block about it, and then I figured out how to do it. But the book was always written with this attitude of, I'm not going to avert my gaze. I'm going to allow the reader to see what needs to be seen, because therein lies the truth. If I cheat the reader of something, they'll sense it. I remember The Guardian interviewing me on the day after I won the Booker Prize, and I was asked the question about, you never provide happy endings, or you never provide, and I'm like, it's not my job to provide solace. That's not, the job is to present the truth. Like, if you want entertainment, go to Netflix. Yeah. You're going to get perfectly entertained, and beautifully so. But that's not my job.
Yeah.
The truth is the sort of the guiding light that I have through my fiction.
Yeah, the second time I read the novel
You've read it twice, oh my dear.
Yes, and I was anticipating chapter 8, and like that, so I literally felt, and this is true, and I don't say this lightly, that grip that took a hold of me from the first scene of the novel, and tightened its grip increasingly throughout the novel. Second time around, I had to work up to chapter 8. I really did, and I cried, and fiction does not make me cry. So yeah. I don't know whether to thank you for that, but in all seriousness, thank you for that.
Yeah, but here's the thing, has it changed you, or has it altered you in any way?
I think so, because I think it is that sense of it is happening elsewhere in the world, and I was very mindful of that. But now I have a sense of, wanting to, how can I be more active in pushing against that? And just that sense of, and also thinking about, myself and comparing myself to Eilish, and would I know when to get out?
Yeah.
Would I know when to realize, no, this shift is real and it's terrifying, and And I suppose it changed me in that it has made me despair, you know, in a deeper way, but I think in an important way. Like, I think too many of us are far too comfortable and complacent when hell is happening on earth, for far too many, and increasingly so. And it is that sense of, you mentioned that earlier, but it could knock on my door. You know, I'm not going to wait, you know, and it shouldn't be about us, right? It's happening to others. Where is our empathy?
Yeah.
I feel it changed me.
I mean, when I was writing the book, I was thinking all the time about how we do judge what we see, because we only have so much bandwidth every day for our own concerns, our families, or whatever it is that's, you know, before us. And I'm not even sure that we're wired for anything beyond the local anyway. You know, it's very hard for us to truly keep in our heads a conceptualization of the global. But we watch and we often judge, even though we shouldn't. But the thing is we often don't have the capacity to truly understand the complexity of what leads a person to the positions that this book ends up on. Yeah. And Nietzsche has this lovely line where he says that something to the effect of that, you know, pity requires a great deal of imagination.
Yeah.
And that's where the fiction writer can come in. That's where you can create the simulation. You can enter into the complexity in its fullness. That's the job. You know, and not going after answers, going after questions.
Well, speaking of the job, the other way that this book changed me is that it made me want to be a hell of a better writer. So, thank you for that. Yeah. We're going to run out of time. Paul, I know I would love to hear you read for us, if you would.
Okay, I'll do a quick reading.
I know everybody else would too, and then we'll see whether or not we have time for the Q&A.
I'll read, and then we'll take 2 questions.
That sounds fair. Thank you.
No statements. You heard me. Okay, a quick reading. The night has come, and she has not heard the knocking, standing at the window looking out onto the garden. How the dark gathers without sound the cherry trees. It gathers the last of the leaves, and the leaves do not resist the dark, but accept the dark and whisper. Tired now, the day almost behind her, all that still has to be done before bed, and the children settled in the living room. This feeling of rest for a moment by the glass, watching the darkening garden, and the wish to be at one with this darkness, to step outside and lie down with it, to lie with the fallen leaves and let the night pass over, to wake then with the dawn and rise renewed with the morning come. But the knocking. She hears it pass into thought, this sharp, insistent rapping, each knock possessed so fully of the knocker, she begins to frown. Then Bailey, too, is knocking on the glass door to the kitchen. He calls out to her, "Ma'am," pointing to the hallway without lifting his eyes from the screen. Eilish finds her body moving towards the hall with the baby in her arms. She opens the front door, and 2 men are standing before the porch glass, almost faceless in the dark. She turns on the porch light, and the men are known in an instant from how they are stood. The night cold air suspiring, it seems, as she slides open the patio door. The suburban quiet. The rain falling almost unspoken onto St. Lawrence Street, upon the black car parked in front of the house. How the men seem to carry the feeling of the night. She watches them from within her own protective feeling. The young man on the left is asking if her husband is home, and there is something in the way he looks at her. The remote yet scrutinizing eyes that make it seem as though he is trying to seize hold of something within her. In a blink, she has sought up and down the street, seeing a lone walker with a dog under an umbrella, the willows nodding to the rain, the strobings of a large TV screen in the Zajic's house across the street. She checks herself then, almost laughing, this universal reflex of guilt when the police call to your door. Ben begins to squirm in her arms, and the older plainclothes man to her right is watching the child. His face seems to soften, and so she addresses herself to him. She knows he too is a father. Such things are always known. That other fellow is much too young, too neat and hard-boned. She begins to speak, aware of a sudden falter in her voice. He will be home soon, in an hour or so. Would you like me to give him a ring? No, that will not be necessary, Mrs. Stack. When he comes home, could you tell him to call us at his earliest convenience? This is my card. Please call me Eilish. Is it something I can help you with? No, I'm afraid not, Mrs. Stack. This is a matter for your husband. The older plainclothes man is smiling fully at the child, and she watches for a moment the wrinkles about the mouth. It is a face put out by solemnity, the wrong face for the job. It is nothing to worry about, Mrs. Stack. Why should I be worried, Garda? Yes, indeed, Mrs. Stack. We don't want to be taking up any more of your time, and aren't we damp enough this evening making calls? It'll be hard work getting ourselves dry by the heater in the car. She slides the patio door closed, holding the card in her hand, watching the two men return to the car. Watching the car move up the street, it brakes for the junction, and its tail lights intensify, taking the look of two eyes agleam. She looks once more onto the street, returned to an evening's quiet. The heat from the hall as she steps inside and shuts the front door, and then she stands a moment examining the card and finds she has been holding her breath. This feeling now that something has come into the house. She wants to put the baby down. She wants to stand and think, seeing how it stood with the two men and came into the hallway of its own accord, something formless yet felt. She can sense it skulking alongside her as she steps through the living room past the children. Molly is holding the remote control over Bailey's head, his hands flapping in the air. He turns towards her with a pleading look. Ma'am, tell her to put my show back on. Eilish closes the kitchen door and places the child in the rocker, begins to clear from the table her laptop and diary, but stops and closes her eyes. This feeling that came into the house has followed. She looks to her phone and picks it up, her hand hesitating. She sends Larry a message, finds herself again by the window watching outside. The darkening garden, not to be wished upon now, for something of that darkness has come into the house. Thank you.
So we'll take a couple of questions, and then afterwards, Paul will be out in the foyer signing books. And again, ask you to please be direct with your questions. Thank you.
Great, no questions. Wonderful.
Any brave soul. Yes. There's a mic. Would you like to approach it, or
Bring the mic to the lady, perhaps. Wouldn't that be the best thing to do?
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. You say that the book came to you in a flash all of a sudden. How much, or the opening came to you all of a sudden. How much of the book in its entirety came to you, and how? How quickly did it come after that?
Well, you always find the work in the writing. Thank you for your question, by the way. You know, I'm somebody who likes a sense of an ending. I like to have, after a period of early writing, to know what I'm writing towards. It's really important to know, or to have a sense of an ending. Because that, for me, shapes the series of equations that I have to write. I look for a sense of inevitability in the text. A sense of, it could only have been this way. And when you have an ending, it becomes this, it locks you into something. And for me, the very last line of the book, if you've read it, you'll know that Eilish says something that's counterintuitive. She says something that ordinarily you would just say, what? No. But she believes it to be true. And so for her to believe it to be true, the book must prove that to be true. And so that's what shapes the writing. And so early on, when I was writing the book, I was reading a Louis Macnice poem, and I didn't quite know what the book was going to be. And then something happened, and it's a very nice thing that happens, where you're reading a poem or something else, and suddenly you just get this glint of light, and it sends you off in another direction. And I just heard the last line of the book. And then I understood what the novel was. I understood that equation, so to speak, and that sort of direction of truth. And then the book took on its own power, its own laws. And anytime I would try to deviate from it, the book would just say no. And it's very powerful when the book tells you how it needs to be. And so essentially what I'm talking about is truth, that you're writing human truth. You're really listening very carefully to what the truth of the story is. And whenever you get fanciful, because all writers get fanciful, wouldn't it be great if I sent her off on this mission here? The book just says no.
Yeah. That is so powerful when you feel and realize that the book is smarter than you.
Of course it is. Yeah.
It's pretty powerful stuff. You remind me of a John Irving interview where he says he knows from the very outset of his novels what the last sentence is, and exactly that he's writing toward that, which I found quite extraordinary, because I write with that matchstick. You know, I can only see as far as the flame. And so the idea of writing towards a very specific sentence, I find that really interesting.
Yeah. I always know the ending.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like the last, like I knew the last line of Grace quite early on. I knew the last line of Beyond the Sea early on. And it becomes, it's like the QED. You're trying to prove something true. You're demonstrating something. And so a last sentence can actually contain within it something almost explosive.
Yeah.
It just seems like a last sentence, but maybe it's not.
Yeah. Well, that last line in Prophet Song would seem to call back to Beyond the Sea. As you say, there's sort of that thread through your now 5 novels.
Yes. As I said, I keep writing the same book over and over again.
I love it. Its own kind of purgatory.
Yeah.
Perpetual return.
Maybe
we'll take
more like perdition, but anyhow.
A final question. Any other brave soul out there? Yes, at the back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I checked the book out of the library and read it, and then went and bought it because I wanted to read it a second time, because it was extremely impactful for me.
Thank you.
But my question is more about your process, because the most creative time in my life was when I had a meditation practice. So I found that interesting that you said that, which has fallen away in the last few years as a result of like COVID and catastrophic wildfire and disease in my family. You know, the life that Eilish is, like just dealing with what you're saying, like having to focus on survival and the intimate. So anyway, I'm trying to rebuild that. But how much of your work comes during meditation or during your dream life, like comes during those experiences or times, as opposed to while you're on the page, like while you're actually physically on the page?
That's a really, really great question, and it's probably a complex answer, but I'm going to do my best to answer it for you. So I am a meditator. I've been meditating for over a third of my life, and it's a fundamental part of who I am now. And the reason it's a fundamental part is because the more you meditate, the more you start to realize that you have been living your life within this very narrow space of selective consciousness. That your consciousness is like this radar just looking for trouble all the time, constantly future-oriented, focused on your anxieties, focused on your desires and your needs. And that, you know, as I said earlier, that's a tiny part of the vast, complex, invisible processing power that you actually have. You cannot see so much of what you're actually doing. You know, and the word the intuitive is shorthand for really what I think of the oracle within, the higher mind, which every one of us has. It's just a matter of getting the space to allow it to come through. But the problem is structurally modern life has become so challenging, so difficult, and writers today are under assault in a way that consciousness, attention is under assault to such a degree that has never, I don't think any writer in history has been under the level, amount of, you know, pressure or distraction. And, you know, the antidote is attention, learning to pay attention to the world, because when you sit with something and you pay it full attention, it opens to you, and it opens up all those doors, or just opens you up your bandwidth, your consciousness beyond that selective attention. But also when you attend inside to yourself, then the inward door opens and the daemonic can come through. And the daemonic is, you know, the Greeks called the daemon the communication between you and the gods. They didn't think that creativity was something that was, that you owned it, that the gods gave it to you. But of course you own it. We know that. People talk about channeling. They think it's coming from the outness. It's coming from within. It's coming from your own enormous power. But what you have to do is to access it. And it's just so hard. So you have to create laws for yourself. You have to make your writing time inviolable. You have to have a bubble that you go into where maybe beforehand you solve some of the problems of your day. But the best way to do that is to come at it in the morning where the problems of your day have not yet had time to work on you. But so I meditate before I write. That's really important to me, and it just keeps the channels open. And, you know, Hermann Hesse, who's a greatly misunderstood writer, and I think I'm going to have to write about Hermann Hesse because people think he's just this writer for adolescents, and it's really seriously to misread what his project is. But he said that all the great people arrive upon meditation, even if they're not meditators. That any form of greatness is arrived because you're accessing that broader consciousness. And the thing about writing itself, the act of writing is an awakening. So when you write, you are awakened, and you're seeing the world in a much, much broader, colorful way. But the problem for most writers is that as soon as they stop writing, they close back down again. Which is why a lot of really famous writers are terribly egoic human beings. Because they go back to the ego. They think that they're marvelous, but when they're not writing, they're just back to the ego state. When they write, they're awake. But the ideal really is to be awake always. And it's very hard to, of course, it's very hard to do that because the world is hitting us from every angle. I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's the best I can do. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Paul, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the great interview. Really great interviewer. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, thank you. A pleasure. Well done. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay. Where do we go now?
I guess we're going down the side and out.